English Canada and Quebec. This is part of a two-part panel, and half the panel isn't here yet. So Mustafa's going to speak early if Chris Janko is here in time. He's running behind with traffic issues. But Mostafa is a community organizer at the Immigrant Workers Centre in Montreal and is active with Tadaman and BDS Quebec and has been active with Labour Solidarity with Palestine. And I'm just going to pass it over to you.
I'm just going to start very loudly. So the aim of the paper, it was supposed to be more about a historical context about Quebec and solidarity with Palestine in particular, and looking at the period of the 60s and 70s and sort of how that led and how that influenced the kind of Palestine solidarity work that's existed with trade unions at the current moment. And because I think, hello. Oh, okay. Because I think for many people, especially in the Canadian and Quebec context, the level of solidarity, the level of international solidarity amongst trade unions in Quebec is at a very different kind of scale than exists in, well, I mean, it's changing, and the sort of the amount of trade unions that are beginning to endorse BDS, the call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, has grown with the new motion by Unifor and the passing of Unifor, CUPE Ontario, the Canadian Union of Postal Workers. But in Quebec, some of the first victories in terms of the boycott and divestment and sanctions campaign, which was put out in 2005 by over 170 Palestinian civil society organizations, trade unions, movements in Palestine and in the diaspora, which called for a comprehensive boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign similar to that of what took place around South African apartheid until Israel fully complies with international law. And some of the victories that existed and took place in Quebec in the short years after 2005 and after the calls were made, FINEC, the teachers' trade union in Quebec, representing CEGEPs, CEGEP teachers, passed a resolution in 2008. Conseil Central of CSN, which represents over 80,000 workers, passed a boycott, divestment, and sanctions resolution in 2010. Then you also have a resolution being passed by Conseil Syndicat National, the second largest trade union federation in Quebec, also passing a BDS resolution. But beyond that, you had ASE, the student union in Quebec representing over 50,000 students, also passed a BDS resolution in 2008. The Fédération de Fête de Québec. So large swaths of Quebec society began to really take up the call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And the question is why? And going back, I think we see some of the lessons and sort of some of the legacy of the trade union militancy in Quebec in the 60s and 70s in terms of internationalism sort of carry on. And that was the aim of, and I think what Kim spoke about this morning in terms of, and the work of Catherine and others to look at labor imperialism. In Quebec, what you really saw was labor anti-imperialism, right? And that, I think, made it very different than the rest of the trade union movement in Quebec, despite the contradictions and limits. So the argument is that during that time, especially after the 1950s, after Duplessis and sort of the conservatism, the authoritarian regime of Duplessis, and sort of the project of Quebec nationalism through sort of what was the three pillars of Duplessis, sort of conservatism, rural development, and sort of a tie to the Catholic Church as being the pillars to sort of French or Francophone Quebecois nationalism changed drastically in the 60s, right? With the Quiet Revolution, with the growth of the Quebec state as being sort of the central pillar of development in Quebec, came with that also sort of a radical politics in terms of looking towards what Sean Mills, historian, described as sort of a period where anti-colonialism and anti-imperialism was really sort of the driving ideology between for Quebec society and for Quebec national movements, but beyond that also trade unions, the women's movement, poor people's movement, that really saw that the control of society and the development of Quebec society was really through an anti-imperialist lens. And you begin to see that with the Quebec trade union movement, where many trade union leaders actually look towards Cuba as sort of a source of inspiration to be able to take control of the state, to be able to develop society in an equitable way that would lead to the development of the Quebecois working class. And they shunned away from what was taking place in France and in Europe. And because there was many actual accuracies. So in the Canadian context, Quebec represented 40% of the unemployed across Canada during that time, even though it was only 23% of the population. 80 to 90% of the employers or the capitalist class was Anglo-Saxon, but increasingly the penetration of American capital and sort of the misery that led for Quebecois workers sort of also led to that thinking and to that analysis. And we see that sort of really take shape in Quebec in 1968, where you begin to actually have where you have the election of Michel Chartrand, who becomes the president of the Conseil Central, of CSN, of the Montreal Labor Council of CSN. You also have the election of Marcel Pépin of the CSN nationally, and sort of the radical politics it represented. And then you also have the CEQ, which is the teachers' union in Quebec, which actually grew by 500% during the 60s because of urbanization and the modernization project of the Quebec state. Also became a real radical force in terms of international solidarity. And sort of those elements by the late 60s also coincided with a great militancy in terms of on the ground in Quebec itself. The overarching analysis was that in Marcel Pépin's great white paper to the CSN, that the working class cannot meet its ends, and the trade union movement cannot meet its ends without actually tackling capitalism itself as an economic system. And this was a white paper presented to the CSN, which had become 200,000 members by 1970, right? So it had grown drastically. And at the same time, sort of the politics of the FTQ, or the Canadian Labour Congress in Quebec had begun to fizzle, not only because state employment had grown drastically, but also because of the NDP's position towards Quebec. Even though CSN sort of implicitly supported the NDP by 1968 over the Quebec question, but sort of muddled the position of the FDQ within Quebec during the late 1960s. And sort of what that translated to in terms of internationalism and international solidarity was really crucial. You have the founding of the Second Front by CSN, which was, so the Second Front in terms of CSN was that simply that we just can't fight around collective agreements. We just can't simply fight around collective bargaining. We have to organize the whole of society, and we have to have an active role in that. And what that meant at the level of the Conseil Central was supporting really international solidarity struggles and diasporas within Montreal. So Michel Chartrand, president of the Conseil Central, opened up the resources of CSN to Palestine Solidarity Committee of Quebec at that time. Paid for the office, paid for the materials in 1968 along with Chilean solidarity networks and other organizing efforts in Latin America. By 1970, the teachers union with actually the Conseil Central organized a week of solidarity against imperialism and a solidarity week with Palestine. As actually people who've been around who've gone to Israeli Apartheid Week, we can actually claim IAW started in 2005, but actually in 1970 in Montreal. And so Yves Charbonneau, the teachers union, actually the way they organized it was that each local was responsible for tabling, organizing an event in their schools, and despite the backlash it received from the media, from the conservatives, was simply that the role of teachers was about transforming the ideas of society, that it went simply beyond just giving people what they were supposed to teach, that teachers had a much larger role in society. So at the end of all of those weeks of the events at the Palestine Week, they'd organized a demonstration at the US consulate and the Israeli consulate. So that was a very important moment in terms of Palestine solidarity and solidifying Quebec's role in that. And it goes further, and I only have 2 minutes. So very quickly, in 1972, the Quebec Trade Union sent their first delegation, not to Palestine itself, because it's occupied after 1967, all of Palestine. So they go to Lebanon, they go to Jordan, they go to Egypt. 3 teacher union presidents from different locals, Yves Charbonneau himself, Michel Chartrand, and actually meets with Arafat. And it's from there, the genesis of the idea, and also after a delegation to Chile to stand in solidarity with Allende and the trade unions in Chile for a socialist project, that the idea of CISO really comes about. So CISO, which still exists to this day, the Centre International Solidaire Ouvrière, which was founded by a conference of over 600 trade unionists from Latin America, Africa, and the Arab world, was really a vehicle for Quebec to show a different kind of international solidarity with trade unions in the global south, because they saw their struggle being linked to anti-imperialist struggles worldwide, and that there was no liberation for the Quebec working class unless there was support for the Cuban Revolution, support for the Palestinians. And so in 1975, the conference was held in Montreal with 600 unionists, 19 different centrals. That was really pivotal. And then in the 1980s, you have 2 delegations again that go to Palestine, openly call for the Canadian government to recognize the PLO, which was extremely controversial because it was considered a terrorist organization at that time, and fundraised for Palestinians in the camps in Lebanon during the Israeli occupation of Lebanon. And that work and that kind of internationalism, I think, is part of what still exists today in Quebec. And I don't think it's because of the particularities there are elements of it because of the particularities of the Quebec context, but I think also because of the ideas that were at the forefront of the trade unions and the kind of organizing, the fact that they spent time to send delegations to meet with Palestinian trade unionists, because they spent the time to do the education work inside the unions, really helped shape that international solidarity, and I think helps shape the kind of international solidarity and the kind of internationalism today that we see in Quebec. Thank you.